Picture this, New Orleans, a little over a century ago. The Great War is over, this city is absolutely buzzing with the birth of jazz. But underneath all that music, a really dark shadow is falling. For about 18 months, the entire city was gripped by fear, terrorized by a mysterious figure who would become one of America's weirdest and most elusive serial killers.
And this is where the story gets just truly strange. In March of 1919, a letter shows up at a local newspaper, supposedly from the killer himself. It's got a threat, for sure, but it also has this incredible, bizarre offer, a promise that music could save you.
I mean, it's a wild idea, right? Could a whole city playing jazz for one night actually stop a murderer in his tracks? That's the central question that makes the Axeman of New Orleans such an enduring mystery, and we're about to dive into exactly how it all went down.
Okay, so to really understand the legend, we have to start with that letter. It is, without a doubt, the most famous piece of evidence in this whole case, and it totally changed the game between the killer and the city he was terrorizing.
So let's break this down. The writer says, yep, I'm the Axeman. He sets a super specific time for his next attack, 12:15 a.m. on March 19th. But then he gives everyone this crazy out. If you have a jazz band playing in your house, he'll just walk on by. He even claimed to be some kind of demon from hell who just happened to love jazz.
So what did the city do? They listened. I mean, what else could they do? That night, New Orleans just exploded with music. You had professionals, you had amateurs, everyone playing jazz into the early morning. The dance halls were completely packed. And, just like the letter promised, nothing. No attacks. The Axeman, it seems, was true to his word.
But that one night of music was really just a surreal little pause in what was an 18-month-long reign of terror. To really get the kind of fear that would drive an entire city to pick up their instruments, we need to rewind and look at the actual crimes. So the attacks kicked off back in May of 1918 with the horrific murder of Joseph and Catherine Maggio in their own home. And for the next year and a half, this pattern of terrifying home invasions just kept happening, before suddenly, it all stopped in late 1919.
And his method, man, this is where it gets really chilling and consistent. He never brought his own weapon. He'd chisel out a panel on a back door, slip inside without a sound, and then he'd find an axe that belonged to the victims themselves. Just think about that. Your own tools, in your own home, turned against you. It's deeply invasive. Now, who was he targeting? Well, the victims were almost all Italian and Sicilian immigrants, and a lot of them were grocers. So right away, people started thinking maybe it was a hate crime or some kind of weird business rivalry, but it was never about robbery. Valuables were always left behind. And while 6 people were tragically killed, a surprising number of people actually survived these brutal attacks, though they could almost never give a good description of the guy.
You know, to really get why this panic took hold, you have to understand the city itself at the time. Early 20th century New Orleans wasn't just a party town, it was a city under a ton of pressure, basically a perfect breeding ground for fear. It really was a perfect storm. You've got this major port city trying to deal with the aftermath of World War I, soldiers coming home, economic stress. You've got these deep-seated tensions between different ethnic groups, and, this is crucial, you have a police force with none of the modern forensic tools we just take for granted. In that environment, you can see how fear and rumor would spread like wildfire. Which, of course, brings us to the police response. Look, hunting a serial killer is incredibly hard today, but back then, with the tools they had, it was basically impossible. I mean, this comparison really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? In 1919, police were working with scattered paper records. Rumors were often treated like actual evidence. There was no such thing as a fingerprint database, no concept of DNA. They were fighting a ghost in the dark, while investigators today have this whole arsenal of science to rely on. So with basically no hard evidence, the police were left with just theories. The focus on Italian grocers made them think it was either racially motivated or maybe even some early mafia stuff. But at the same time, that super specific method of his, the MO, made it seem like the work of one single person. Without proof, though, they were all just educated guesses. So in the end, the investigation just went nowhere. A few people were arrested for individual attacks, but usually on the flimsiest of evidence. The police could never ever definitively connect one person to all the crimes. The Axeman just stayed a phantom.
And then after that final attack in October 1919, the Axeman just vanished. The terror was over, but the mystery was only just beginning, and that's how his story became one of America's greatest unsolved legends. So why? Why, over 100 years later, do we still have no idea who this guy was? Well, it pretty much boils down to a few things. No forensic evidence meant nothing to physically connect the crime scenes. The sloppy records made it impossible to track patterns. And the public panic created so much noise and so many false leads that it probably drowned out anything real. And here is one last fascinating twist from modern historians. Someone named Miriam C. Davis pointed out that the famous letter, with its really sophisticated language, doesn't really fit the profile of the brutal, uneducated killer the police thought they were looking for. Which raises a wild question. Was the letter even from the killer at all? Or was it some kind of sick prank by a completely different person?
And because he was never caught, he was never really defeated. He just walked off the stage, leaving behind this terrifying legacy that slowly turned into folklore. He stopped being a man and started being a ghost story, a dark piece of history forever woven into the fabric of New Orleans and the very music that supposedly kept him away.
And so we're left to wonder, who was he? A lone madman? A hitman for organized crime? Or has the story just become so tangled up in folklore that the truth of the actual person is lost to time? That, right there, is the enduring mystery of the Axeman of New Orleans.